Hello again, flute tubers. Today we're finally getting to one of the topics that I've had the very most requests for, which is vibrato. We're going to talk first about the mechanics of how you actually make vibrato, and then I'll give you two of my favorite exercises for vibrato. These exercises are great if you're just starting vibrato for the first time. Also, if you want to re-examine and improve your vibrato and gain more control over it. And they're also excellent teaching tools. I have to admit it's true, I've been postponing and delaying this topic a bit. Vibrato is such a complicated topic. It's something that happens all internally and we can't see and evaluate what we're doing. So we have to understand things like support before we tackle this more complicated issue of vibrato. Also, vibrato is one of the very most controversial topics out there in the flute world. Not that the flute world is just swimming in controversy, but there's a lot of discussion about exactly how you make it and what you should be focusing on. That being said, there's much less controversy now than there was a few decades ago. We have technology to thank for that. Because a few decades ago, there started to be some people who did studies on this. They would take a little video scope and stick it down the throat of the world's best singers and flute players and other wind players and look at what happened while these people made vibrato. So now there's a lot less guesswork about what's happening with vibrato. If you can remember back to episode 5, I talked in that episode about how I would never teach a student vibrato until their support is absolutely in place. Support is especially crucial and fundamental to being able to make a really good vibrato. Sometimes when I've inherited students who've just sort of figured out vibrato on their own, I've had to tell them, stop using any vibrato. Let's go back and get the fundamentals of support in place and a completely consistent airstream. And once those fundamentals are in place, then we can reincorporate the vibrato. When you use vibrato, what parts of your air system inside your body are involved? Well, you can get your answer looking at this balloon. Surprise! This is another thing that I talk to my students about picturing all the time, but I've never actually brought a balloon into a lesson. But if you look at this balloon, this is the way your air system should be. And this is the way it is if you're using support, because it's all connected. You have your mouth here, you have your windpipe, you got your lungs, and whatever I do at any point affects the rest of the balloon. So if I'm letting air out here through my mouth, everywhere that I put my hand on this balloon, I can distinctly feel that it's all responding. Another great image for this, although I must admit I did not go buy one of these, but it's a trampoline. If you think of the surface of a trampoline, there's a little bit of surface tension on the whole thing because it's all connected. And if you think of jumping up and down on a trampoline while there are people sitting around you on the edges of the trampoline, everybody feels the bounce. That idea of the balloon is a great way to get more specifically into the mechanics of how to make a vibrato. And I think it's very important to know what the mechanics are. So the big controversy used to be that people would say things along the lines of, use your diaphragm to make the vibrato. That's not a horrible thing to say, but it is a bit of a misnomer because your diaphragm is most of the time an involuntary muscle. It's the muscle that you use to expand your lungs and then let them deflate, even when you're not conscious, even when you're asleep. And it's not where we get the power in our playing. We use our lower abdominal muscles beneath the diaphragm for that power. It's the same muscles that would engage if I went over to that piano and pushed it hard in order to get it to move. Come on, piano! Come on! But what's been shown in these recent studies is that basically the controls of your vibrato are in your throat. So when I showed you the balloon, this is like those little muscles in your throat. And when I do this, that's like vibrato or like articulation, that then the whole balloon responds to what I'm doing right here in my throat. But here's an interesting paradox for you. The very fact that those little muscles that control your vibrato are located in your throat is exactly the reason why I won't teach any of my students vibrato until they have their support well in place. Otherwise, what happens if you use those little muscles in your throat, but it's not connected to the support, you get what the flute community lovingly calls a nanny goat vibrato. You can hear it's kind of wobbly and uncontrolled, but if I re-engage my support, if I do just the same thing in my throat, it becomes a real vibrato. But if I kind of chop the support off just below my throat and I disengage those big powerful muscles, that's when I get the nanny goat vibrato. As flute players, we're always striving to harness the strength and stability that we can get from our big powerful muscles while we perform the more complex, intricate tasks with our weaker, smaller, more fragile muscles. This applies to our finger technique, it applies to what we do with our embouchure, and it also applies to vibrato. We want the strength and stability that we get from our support muscles while we control the actual speed and width of the vibrato with these little muscles in our throat. Speed and width are two aspects of vibrato where you want as much control and flexibility as you can possibly develop. That's our goal in doing vibrato studies, rather than simply deciding that you will make your vibrato feel natural. You want that extra level of control so you can make decisions about vibrato and execute your own artistic vision of how your vibrato should sound within the music that you're playing. This is one that I like to use when students know how to support, to get them to connect their vibrato to support. So I'm going to turn the metronome on to quarter note equals 60, and I'm going to play one vibrato beat per metronome beat, just starting on the C and the staff. Just using tone studies, going down a half step at a time, and I'm saying ha from my low abdominal muscles. My whole air column is moving a lot. If you're talking about being on a trampoline, that might be where you're jumping and bouncing as high up into the air as you can. Now I'm going to keep the metronome on 60, but I'm going to do 2 per metronome beat. So I'm just getting faster. I'm still feeling the vibrato deep in my abdominal muscles. I'm still saying ha, ha, ha. And this is connecting my vibrato to the support. But as we get faster, you'll see that the vibrato kind of has to move up your air column. Because if you're using fast vibrato and you're using those low abdominal muscles to make it, those big muscles just don't have the fine control that the little muscles in your throat have. So now I'm going to do 3 beats. Here we go. As your vibrato gets faster and you allow it to move upwards in your air column, you want to know where you're really aiming for in the end. We mentioned that it's in your throat, but how do you know that you found the right place? You don't want to go too high up in your throat. You want to keep thinking as low in your throat as you can. That keeps your energy low, it keeps you easily connected to your support, and it keeps your throat relaxed. But technically, where you're really aiming for is your glottis. Do you know what your glottis is? It's the muscle that you use to close so that things don't get into your lungs. And the best way to know if you're aware of where your glottis is if you can make a glottal stop. English is a language that doesn't use glottal stops, but there are languages that use them as a regular consonant. If you can close your glottis, then the glottal stop is made when you open it back up, your vocal cords kind of rub together and they make a consonant sound like this. If you can do that, it's good to practice it as a kind of a vocalized articulation into your flute to see if you've got control of that glottis. So you can do like this. You can play a song if you want to. So there's your glottis, now you know. And that's the mechanism that gives you really fine control over your vibrato. There are a couple more details to know besides just where it is though. One is we talk about width of vibrato, and how much you close your glottis is responsible for how wide your vibrato is. If I nearly close it all the way, I get a very wide vibrato. If I just barely close it, I just oscillate it a tiny little bit, I get a very narrow vibrato. The other thing that is controlled by your glottis is the speed of the vibrato. That I think is pretty self-evident, that if I go but I just don't close it all the way, I'm gonna get a fast vibrato, whereas if I do that will be a very slow vibrato. Now we're ready for our second vibrato exercise that I want to give you today. This is my personal favorite vibrato exercise, and I like to do this in triplets. The reason I like to do it in triplets is that we as human beings tend to associate duples more with the beat. Maybe it's because we're human beings, we have 2 legs and 2 feet. Maybe if we had 3 legs and 3 feet, we would feel triplets more naturally. For vibrato, this is an advantage because we don't want to associate too closely the vibrato with whatever the beat is in the piece that we're playing. But this exercise, I like to start at quarter note equals 80 and play triplets. This is the same speed that we stopped the other exercise. We were doing 4 beats at 60. Now we're doing 3 beats at 80. So we're just picking up right where we left off. If you're still trying to be sure you know where your glottis is, it's good to start by doing triplets with glottal stops, just completely closing your glottis like this. Then to make the vibrato, you just stop closing it all the way. You start to let it run together by not completely closing your glottis. I'm still nearly closing my glottis, so it's a pretty wide vibrato. I could do a narrow vibrato if I want. So this exercise ends up giving you a lot of flexibility regarding just how wide your vibrato is. When you have this really great at 80, we're gonna gradually speed it up until we can get it to 120. 120 is a pretty fast vibrato, especially in the low register. And you might be thinking, would I ever want a vibrato that fast? But in the high register, we use vibrato that fast all the time. There are lots of fast, excited, energetic endings where you want a very shimmery, fast vibrato. So you can hear that this exercise gives you so much flexibility with your vibrato. Ultimately, vibrato is one of the most personal things about flute playing. Everybody's vibrato will sound different and unique. So if the point is to sound natural and to sound like yourself, why are we trying so hard to control it? The more control you have, the more flexibility it gives you in terms of what you can accomplish as an artist. I'm sure you've all heard flute players talk about using different tone colors. You might have heard people say things like, use a dark tone color right here. Think of a very pale yellow tone right here. And you might have even thought, what exactly are you talking about? But vibrato is one of the very best ways to change what we call tone color. Today we've covered the basics of vibrato, and there are a lot more exercises that you can do out there. But no matter what your level is, These two are always good to come back to, especially the second one, because it will ultimately give you many more choices as far as how wide and how fast you want your vibrato to be in the music that you're playing.